Welcome to the Fairfield County Look Magnolia Palace dinner and cocktail party. First of all, I want to thank Stubbs and Wooten for your fabulous presentation and your phenomenal Frick shoes. We are very excited about the Frick Museum and the shoes. Pure Insurance, thank you so much for being here. Delighted that you guys could make it and be part of this. And we want to thank Northern Trust. You guys have been with us partners for a long time and many times, and we've had a lot of fun with art events, especially like this one. And I want to introduce Henry Johnson, who has had a long, distinguished career in the financial services. He is Executive Vice President of Northern Trust, President of the East Region, meaning up and down the entire coast of the United States. Henry has many philanthropic accomplishments. In fact, he's been honored by the Frick Museum, and last night he was honored by the UGA Trust and Estates dinner. So I'm delighted, and Henry's got a lot to say because he's got a big tie-in with this gang right here. Yay!
Thank you very much.
Sure.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Elaine. This is a wonderful series that you do. But this was one that there was no way I wasn't going to come for. So thank you very, very much for pulling this extraordinary group together. And it's rooted in the Frick in a variety of different ways. So yeah, my job this evening is to introduce, I'm going to step away from that speaker maybe, to introduce everybody. But I thought I would start with a little bit of a story about myself and the Frick and what a magical place it is. Thank you. I went to Vassar College in the fall of 1984. I was in the 15th year of coeducation at Vassar. I was a financial aid kid from Louisiana, and when you took classes and things that you didn't know anything about, you would turn your papers in early to make sure that your grades, the professors could give you pointers and you keep your grades up, and that's how your scholarship kept working. And I took art history because at Vassar in 1985, it wasn't technically a required class, but you basically couldn't graduate from Vassar without taking art history. And so I did. I took the class. And I would turn my papers in early, as I said, and I happened to write a paper that's about a painting that's in your book. This is a completely true story. Ian knows it because I've told it before. I wrote a paper on a painting by Vermeer called Officer and Laughing Girl. And I turned it in early, and a couple days later I got a note in my mailbox from the professor saying she wanted to see me. And I tell you, that's not a good thing. I went to see her, and she said, "This is a perfectly good paper, but it is abundantly clear, and on every page, you've never seen this painting," which was true. I hadn't gone to see it. And she said, "You should go to New York. You should see this painting. Rewrite the paper after you've seen it." And I told her the truth, which was that I had never been to New York City, that going to New York cost $30, and I didn't spend that much money in a month. And she, in one of the great acts of philanthropy in my life, reached into her handbag and gave me $30 and said, "Go see the painting." And it totally changed my life. I went to New York. I walked from Grand Central to the Frick. It was the first time I'd ever been to a museum. And as you describe, crossing that threshold is an extraordinary collision with a life and purpose of multiple people. Frick himself, his daughter, and I saw the painting, I rewrote the paper, I changed my work-study job, I became a gallery guard at the Vassar Art Gallery, and I spent a lot of time with those works, and I came to New York, I started working in New York, I would visit places, and one of those places I started to visit a lot was the Frick. And one of the amazing things about museums, people think about them as these hard places to connect to, but the fact of the matter is, their doors are flung open for people who are curious, and both Ian, his predecessor Anne, have been amazingly, fantastically supportive of my personal curiosity, and as a result, both with the firm I used to work for and today at Northern Trust, we've underwritten 15 or 16 different exhibitions over the last 10 or 15 years. It's a remarkable place. It's a transformative place, and it does not surprise me in any way that it would be the setting for a remarkable fictional retelling of a remarkable set of historical facts. My wife is an art historian. The character of the model is one I've heard about in the past. It was amazing to read your book. If you have one, the good news is we're giving you all of this book, which I enjoyed immensely. But I should just explain, not just the connection to Fiona, who's going to talk about her remarkable Magnolia Palace this evening, but Deborah and I have actually known each other for a number of years as well. We, in shared service to a number of institutions, we have great passion for gardens. We sat on the Garden Conservancy Board together. We are together on the board of New York Botanical Garden, where Deborah and her husband Chuck are leaving for the ball shortly. I'm guessing that might be where you're headed to. I'm not, because I have to go to Rome tomorrow. So, Deborah and I have a great passion for preservation, as does Deborah's husband Chuck, who also sits as a trustee of none other than the Frick Collection. So this is an extraordinary group of people here. Ian leads today one of the most dynamic collections of art in the world. It is in a period of incredible transformation. People talk about the Frick as a magical place to see art in a setting of a home. One of the things you get to do right now, because the Frick is going through an incredibly important renovation, is to go see those paintings outside of the home they've lived in for a long time. Not just the paintings, but the remarkable decorative arts at Frick Madison, which I urge you to do. The Frick Madison is what used to be the old Whitney Museum. If you think about that Marcel Breuer building on Madison Avenue, it was the Whitney moved downtown, and then for a number of years the Metropolitan called it the Met Breuer. Today it is the Frick Madison, and it is one of the most remarkable things to go. If you think you know a painting from the Frick, go see it again. We were just talking about this. Progress of Love, which is the Fragonard series. I was just saying this to Ian. To see that painting de-installed as a decoration in a room, as a series of paintings that together form the walls of a room as they were intended for Madame Pompadour. Today, to see them individually as works of art is absolutely staggering. The side panels, which you almost don't see when you go to the Frick, stand alone as paintings at Frick Madison, and they are magnificent, absolutely magnificent. So this is a remarkable group we have together. Deborah is an amazing storyteller. She's also an amazing author in her own right. Both of their books will be in your bag. I do want to just say, we purchased all of them from Diane's here. If you don't know Diane's, it's an amazing local bookseller. And we have them for all of you. Deborah and I have worked together on really fun things and really hard things. She is an incredible distiller of facts and narrative, which makes her an amazing person. It also makes her an amazing author and an amazing person to turn this over to for a discussion about Fiona's remarkable work in concert with Ian's leadership of what I think is, for me at least, the most consequential arts institution in my life. So.
Thank you, Henry. I think we'll just sort of pass the mic. How does that work? So I'm not going to do any bios are done. So that takes that away. Thank you. That was so much better than anything I could have said. One thing we have mics. One thing I'd like to say about the Frick as well. And you really captured something so important. I raised two daughters. I have stepchildren, but I raised two daughters, and we lived in many places in the world. We lived in Los Angeles, we lived in Paris, and we lived in New York. And for my eldest daughter, Alexandra, who is now part of the junior, whatever it is, junior committee, the Young Fellows of the Frick, I don't know if this is still true, but at a certain time, you could not go to the Frick Museum until you were 12 years old.
It's 10 now.
So, 10.
Slowly moving
This
down
was
in age.
what she wanted to do when she turned 12. And we lived at the time in Mamaroneck, New York, and we made a plan with her and a girlfriend, and we went into New York, and we spent the day at the Frick. And it was aspirational, and I think obviously very formative for this girl, it's her favorite museum, and she's lived everywhere in the world, so.
Could I just say that Henry, when his son turned 10, brought him to the Frick, and I greeted him and gave him a little letter and so we like this as a rite of passage to bring children to the Frick when they're of age. And I also, you heard Henry speak so passionately about art. You can imagine how hard it is to give a tour, for me to give a tour when Henry's listening, because he's ready to correct me on any slightest mistake. He knows our collection so well.
And can I just add, I was doing a book talk at a literary festival in New Jersey 2 weeks ago, and a woman came up to me after and she said, "You know what? I'm the reason why you can't get into the Frick unless you're 12. She said in 1966 or something like that, her mother took her there. She was 2. She ran rampant through the place, and right after that, they made the age limit.
I'm glad I now know the reason.
Which is an excellent segue to Fiona's book. So I love this book so much, and you all know that Fiona writes the most wonderful historical fiction that you set in incredible, not only in an incredible place like New York, but extraordinary institutions and specific places within the city of New York. So one of the things I want to ask you to begin, in this book, as in many of, why don't you do your little elevator pitch about the book first before I ask you the question I have? Because for those of you who haven't read it, this would be the right place to start.
Okay, so it's 2 timelines. In 1919, it's from the point of view of an artist's muse, a very famous model in New York, based on an actual model, who falls into hard times, and she seeks refuge in the Frick, working as the private secretary to Helen Frick, who's very temperamental and prickly. And as she does so, she gets very caught up in the family drama, including missing diamonds, romantic trysts, and she kind of gets very caught up in what's going on in the family at that time. And 1919 was a very pivotal year in the Frick family. And then in 1966, it's from the point of view of a fashion model named Veronica. And she's doing a Vogue photo shoot at the Frick, which goes terribly wrong. She's not a very good model. And she gets stuck inside during a 3-day snowstorm, along with an intern. And she stumbles upon a series of hidden messages that are tucked within the artwork of the Frick. And this leads her on a scavenger hunt that she hopes might solve all of her financial problems, as well as possibly solve a decades-old murder in the Frick family. How's that?
That is excellent, excellent. I think you've said that before. So the first question I want to ask, so where do you start? Character, story, or place? And did you choose the Frick, or did the Frick choose you? Because that's kind of, each of your characters ends up there almost in spite of herself. Nobody has kind of gotten a map and figured out that she wants to go to the Frick. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the building tends to come first. And so I'd always loved the Frick, and I think it's just such a gem of a museum. And if you ask any New Yorker what their favorite museum is, it tends to be the Frick. But I was worried about setting a story there because it's not as well known as some of the other locations I've done, like the Dakota or Grand Central. And I loved it so much, and I remember going and wandering through the halls and how, you know, you have this sun streaming in and these beautiful furnishings, but the focus is always on the artwork. And that was slightly intimidating because I'd taken an art history course pass-fail in college and I passed, so I should write an entire book about art history. And so I was a little nervous about it, but what I loved especially about it was that the building, if you do two timelines, you need to have the building change. And so the Frick was a residence. It was the home of the 3 Fricks, Helen, Henry, and his wife Adelaide. There were a family of 3 served by a staff of 27. And they were surrounded by all of this beautiful artwork, but they were really haunted by a tragedy that happened many years ago when the older sister to Helen Frick passed away under terrible circumstances, which are described in the book. And I just loved the fact that it had been a residence to this very complicated family and then became a museum, because in that way I can compare and contrast how the building and the people and the city have changed over time.
So I'd love you to talk a little bit. When I was reading the book, I thought the model you may have had in mind might have been Evelyn Nesbit. It was not. It was a model, an artist model by the name of Audrey Munson, and I'm unfamiliar with her. Evelyn Nesbit has more notoriety. She was the girl in the red velvet swing. Stanford White was murdered in sort of a love triangle to do with her, and her life was ruined from that. And so I want to hear a little bit about Audrey Munson and who she was. And these, you refer to so many iconic statues. She posed for many sculptors in New York City at the time. And it's such a wonderful tour of sculptures. So would you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. If you look above the Frick doorway, and carved in the pediment is a reclining nude. And I learned as I was researching the building that that was Audrey Munson. And it just sent me down such a rabbit hole. Audrey Munson was the supermodel of the early 1900s. She was very famous for having this classical beauty. She had a long nose, a narrow chin, narrow shoulders, curvy hips. She was best known for the dimples on her lower back. And she posed for all of these very, very famous sculptors. And her life was very interesting. She was doing very well, and then she got caught up in this scandal where her landlord killed his wife, and the police, as they were investigating, discovered a black and white photo of Audrey Munson in a bathing suit from an ad that she'd done. And they assumed it was a love triangle. And so that sent her and her mother upstate New York to kind of get out of the way. And that's where the book and my character, who I call Lillian, diverges, because I wanted to do something different. I didn't want it to be exactly Audrey Munson. And in the author's note, I try and explain it very clearly. But in Audrey Munson's life, she went upstate. She didn't do well. She tried to get into silent films. That did not work. She tried to die by suicide by drinking mercury. And then finally, her mother put her in asylum, where she died, get this, in 1996, at the age of 104. And at that point, she was buried in an unmarked grave. And I just thought, here's this woman who's so lost to history. We know the sculptors' names, but she was overshadowed by them. We don't know hers. And at the same time, you have Helen Frick, who was this very interesting woman, very complicated, who in her own way was overshadowed by her father and all of his accomplishments. And so in my writer's mind, and you know this, you start thinking, well, what if these two people met, right? This wild child artist's model and this very temperamental woman. And the story really kind of flew out from there. There's no sign that they ever met, but that's where the kind of the fact and the fiction started to meld together. And of course, you can speak more to the actual facts of the family and that. But what's wonderful as an author is you're looking for a complicated family, you know, complicated, tumultuous people, because they really jump off the page. And the Fricks just handed it right over to me.
That is something I would love to hear from you, Ian, your experiences with the Frick family, and a little bit about Henry Clay Frick and his amassing of that collection.
Sure. Well, I just want to start by saying I love the fact that you're rediscovering some of the women's roles in the Frick, from Audrey Munson, who's been rediscovered recently as a model, to Helen Clay Frick herself. And I think she deserves to have more headlines in the story, because she's the person who begins the Frick Art Reference Library in 1920 in honor of her father a year after he dies. It is now one of the top 5 art reference libraries in the world. It's an amazing resource, and she started it, and she ran it. And I remember when I was a graduate student in the 70s in New York, she was a formidable figure. You were not allowed to enter the library unless, if you were a gentleman, you had a jacket, and if you were a lady, you had to wear a skirt. and they kept one of each items in the cloakroom downstairs, and I remember wearing the scratchy, Harris tweed that was left for men, and so she was a very exacting, formidable character, and she also was responsible for the expansion of the collection after her father's death. I think that's something that we're trying to explain better now, but she was the head of the acquisitions committee at the Frick for decades after her father dies in 1919. And it's thanks to Helen Clay that we have one of the great collections of early Italian Renaissance pictures. Henry himself was not a particularly religious man, so he tended to shy away from Italian Renaissance topics. But Helen was a kind of art historian in her own right, very serious. So just 2 pictures that she bought in 1 year. In 1927, she bought the Duccio that comes from the Maestà. He's one of the great, perhaps the godfather of the Italian Renaissance. She bought that picture, it's the greatest example by Duccio in this country, and she bought our great Ingres, Comtesse d'Aussonville, in 1 year in 1927. Just to give you some sense of her sense of quality and how she continued the tradition of her father, but she also expanded the collection. And as a family member, she had the authority to do that. So I love the fact that you've brought her to life. She was, as you suggest, a prickly, difficult woman. You talk about the fact that she worked in the Red Cross in the First World War, and as a result of that, she hated Germans. She wouldn't allow Germans in the library, which was a little bit of a problem because the Germans basically invented art history in the late 19th century. But she was that kind of a person. And so what I like about the book is you bring her to life in a way, and the encounters between her and Lillian, for example. I love the fact that Lillian basically gets the job with Miss Frick when she interviews to be her personal secretary, because she had been a model. She recognizes one of the sculptures and could tell Helen Clay the name of the sculptor, but she's not an art historian. She just happens to have been posing for those sculptures. So anyway, Helen Clay is, I think, one of the great untold stories of the Frick, and I'm glad that you singled that out.
So one of the stories you tell, let's talk about that, about her loathing of Germans. You give an anecdote that when she was with the Red Cross, she had seen a young French woman who was horribly disfigured by dogs that the Germans set upon her, and it really changed her forever after having seen that. Was that true?
I have to think. I can't remember if that may have been mentioned in one of the biographies on Helen Frick, or it may have been from just my research generally in the war. What I do know is that she went off to France, and it was really hard on her, the devastation and the violence. And when she came back, she was very changed. Her father talked about how she could no longer walk straight through Grand Central. She had to stick to the perimeter. And I think things like that make her much more vulnerable than she might come across. I remember doing research and finding a 1939 New Yorker profile, a 2-part profile on Helen Frick, that described her as a woman of extremely robust prejudices. And this is a woman who, if her friends bobbed their hair, which was very popular in the 1920s, she dumped them. She wore a kind of a pompadour and a bun pretty much her entire adult life. And she was just a woman who stuck to what she felt was correct. And I think if she was born later, she might have run the world. But at that time, she was very constrained. And so it's kind of a mix of fact and fiction within that book. She was very, very struck by what happened in World War I.
So if you talk a little bit about the research process with historical fiction, because you're obviously weaving together bits of history and then turning it in at some point to fiction. So I'd love to know how much of your research you actually did at the Frick, and how much interchange the two of you had along the way. I'd love to hear some stories about all that.
Well, in January of 2020 was when I thought I'd look at the Frick, and I went and got this wonderful behind-the-scenes tour. The marketing person, Heidi, there is terrific, and she happens to only wear vintage 40s and 30s clothes, so we were a really good match. And she took me down to the bowling alley in the basement, up to the top floor where there's a fur vault, as one has. And it was just, I could see every room was such a setting, like the Fragonard room for the interview. You could really feel the story coming to life. But then, of course, the city shut down. And so I really had to go online. And luckily, the digital archives and the archivists at the Frick were so helpful of sending me dinner menus from 1915 and, the 7 courses that the 30 people at the dinner ate. Or a full list of the staff, of their names, the payroll, how much were they paid, what was their nationality. And so that helped really flesh out the house. And then from there, the Frick as well has this wonderful 360-degree floor plan online. So as I was writing a book set in the library, a scene, I could jump into the library virtually and look around as if I was there. So, okay, what's above the fireplace? Right, how would I describe that stairway? And that, thank goodness, saved the day because there was no visiting.
Yeah, I mean, the Frick actually, surprisingly, had one of the very first virtual tours of its museum. It started about 25 years ago, and it's just improved. And when the pandemic hit, if you wanted to visit the Frick, you could, but you could do it virtually. And so you could go into a room, and you could click on a picture, find out everything you wanted to know about it, and then move on to the next one. But what I loved about your novel at a time when none of us could visit the Frick, and in fact, right now, it's under construction, as Henry was saying earlier in an answer to a question from the audience. The Frick has many needs, and for decades has needed more space to show its collection, a conservation space, a larger auditorium, better space to have temporary exhibitions, and its infrastructure. It's an old house, which you capture well, and the skylights need to be replaced. The electrical system hasn't been updated since your novel, in 1935. So it's time to do all that, and so we've closed the museum, and as Henry was saying, we had the good fortune of being able to take over a former museum, the former Whitney building, where you can see all our collection. We've moved the entire staff. 800,000 volumes of the library have been moved off-site, but you can still ask for them and see them at Frick Madison. But at a time when the building itself, our original home, is closed for reconstruction, you can see it virtually, or you can capture it in your mind in the novel. So that's what I really enjoyed, was sort of going through the house through your imagining of scenes taking place in 2 different times. And what I also like is, I sort of wanted to ask you this, but why, 1919 is a pivotal year, I certainly understand. And then you chose 1966. I'm sort of curious why. I think I can sense why, but it's also 2022. So there's another 60 years on, and there's another change happening, as you say. And you first set the novel when it was a mansion and lived in by the Fricks. Then the other part is at a time when it's now become formally a museum. And then today, it's actually closed for yet another renewal of itself. So anyway, I'm just wondering about your choice of time.
And the 60s I chose because I hadn't worked in that decade before. It was a new one for me. And I also needed the technology to be not too advanced so I could trap 2 people in the museum, right? And they couldn't use cell phones to just say, come get me. And I did that, so they're in this snowstorm, and I just decided to give myself a couple challenges where I wanted a limited number of characters over a limited time period in a limited setting for that specific timeline. So it's 2 characters over the course of 3 days at the Frick. And only later, after the book came out, I was being interviewed for something, and I realized I had quarantined my characters, right?
But you also begin with the Spanish flu in 1919.
That's true, yeah. And so I think that might be why. And what was so much fun about writing about the artwork was that I could go online and learn so much about each piece of art that was in the scavenger hunt. And they're all connected by very bad poetry. Those are the clues. And I learned that I write really good bad poetry. It comes very easily. But it was so much fun picking those paintings. And for example, learning things like, and this is from where the staff were so helpful, learning the Bellini. I said, what's the most popular painting? And they said it's the Bellini because the carpet wears out quicker in front of it. And so it's learning those details that really make the museum come to life.
It's one of the challenges of running a museum is that you have to get new carpets on a regular basis, but we are an old house and we are committed to that.
So I have a question for you, Ian. We are at this moment, so you've talked a little bit about what the Frick is doing and its expansion, which, hasn't been an easy path at every turn, and it's going along beautifully. And one of the unintended consequences that is, of course, that you ended up having just down the road a fully empty museum available for hire. I mean, what are the odds of that when you're closing your museum, that you'd have an empty one a few blocks down? So you move the collections over, and as you said, they show very differently. So an unintended consequence is people are enjoying it. Is there a future for that building as in some relationship with the original Frick?
Well, that's a question it's sort of the second question that everybody asks me, what's going to happen to that building next? I don't think it has a future with us. It's still owned by the Whitney. When they moved downtown several years ago to the meatpacking district, they've had great success down there. They kept ownership of this building, I think, because at that time they imagined they might want to have an uptown branch. They've changed their minds, and in the meantime, as you know, as Henry said, they leased it to the Metropolitan Museum. We're, to use New York real estate parlance, we're subleasing for 3 years, and we sort of got lucky, as you suggest, because I actually thought we were going to have to put the entire collection into storage. There came a moment for the project when we realized that it was such a pervasive project, touching every inch of the space, that we would have to close, move the collection, move the staff. And I thought all the collection was going to go into storage, which would have been very sad for 3 years. So I started going around town trying to find some place where we might have a few galleries to show our collection. And my friend at the Guggenheim, Richard Armstrong, said, "Oh, you can have the Guggenheim," which would have been fascinating, but it would have only been for 4 months. So eventually I got to the Frick Whitney and to the Met Breuer. Sorry, we've had a lot of names thrown around about that building. And it was just pure luck, really, that the Met wanted out at that point. It had become quite difficult for the Met to maintain that. And we needed a space. The timing was just about perfect. And that was a stroke of luck. But so for us, we have the entire collection. What's not on view is in storage. And for an art museum to be able to monitor your collection at all times is really critical. We're able to run our programs, library programs, our conservation, our staff is there, albeit in a pandemic, many are still working remotely. But as has been suggested, one of the most interesting things was this opportunity that so rarely comes to rethink a museum's collection. And we had to. We couldn't have tried to recreate the Frick, the mansion, which Fiona has done so beautifully in the imagination of a novel. It would have made no sense. It would have looked like a pastiche. So we had to come to terms with dealing with Marcel Breuer and what he left us in a brutalist building. And so we show the collection by period, by country, which is something we've never done before. In the mansion, it's what works well together in a living room or in a library or in a dining room. Here, we've pulled it apart, looked at the different aspects of the collection, stripped away the decor. And the good news is our collection is so strong that they can stand on their own, even on very severe walls. And I think it's renewed people's love of and appreciation of our collection. We have one of the great collections of old masters anywhere in the world. People perhaps started to take it for granted a little bit in the decor of the mansion. Stripping away the decor, you're reminded how great the collection is. And people have really thought about it in new ways. As Henry was saying, he saw the hollyhock paintings in a way he'd never seen before. So it's made us think about the collection in a new way, and I think it's made our audience kind of intrigued and thinking about it in fresh light. So we hope to have all of you come and see us when we're open in 2+ years back in our permanent home, and celebrate the return.
Quick question on that to follow up. Will you reassemble the collection as it was seen, and will you redecorate in some sort of Aristotelian year, like this is the year that we should always remember this house with, the green sofa or whatever? How will you decide all that?
People love the Frick for what it has as an atmosphere of the Gilded Age. And there are no strictures. Henry did not leave in his will any requirements that everything had to be where it was when he left it. Unlike, say, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum or the Barnes, where everything has to be where the founder left it. So we don't have to do that. And in fact, Henry was buying a lot. Things were moving around quite often in his years. So it's hard to say exactly what was the perfect, what he wanted exactly as an installation. The living room, to me, living hall is the most perfect expression of his taste, with the two Holbeins squared off against one another across the chimney piece, the very stern-looking El Greco of St. Jerome looking down, the Bellini opposite. But there's a Middle Eastern carpet, there's Chinese porcelain, there's French 18th century furniture, in this wonderful mix that expresses all the interests of some of the top collectors of the day. It's a room that really couldn't be improved, I think. And so that's a room we'll always keep the same. Others we may tinker with a little bit, but we don't want to change the essence of the Frick. People love that. Where we will make some changes is the second floor. We're opening the second floor for the first time, which is where the bedrooms were. You set some of the scenes in your novels up there. My office, the director's office, for many years, has occupied what used to be Mrs. Frick's boudoir. And if you visited the Frick, you would know it better as the Boucher room, which was moved downstairs in 1935 when we opened as a public museum. We're going to move it back where it was. So there'll be some anchors to you, the visitor, to suggest what it was like when the Fricks were there. Their breakfast room, we can reconstitute almost exactly, but almost everything else was stripped out in the 1930s after Mrs. Frick died, because the Frick thought at that time they were going to turn the second floor into galleries, public galleries. It never happened, but here we are 85 years later, finally getting to that plan. The Frick is very slow and deliberate, and it will give us more space to show the collection, but it also gives us a chance to suggest to the public how the whole house worked. Most people have seen the ground level, which are the grand rooms for entertaining, and they've not seen the more private rooms that gets into the lives of the Frick, which Fiona expresses so well. So I'm eager to see what that will be like. I think it will make the whole house come alive in a way that it never has.
Before we open it up to questions, which we will do in a minute, I always like to ask writers, what are you working on now? Are you sticking with New York? Where in New York? What can you tell us?
Yeah, so the next book, I was trying to figure out where to set it. And I got an email through my website of a woman, and she said, I'm 83, I live in South Carolina, I'm a former Rockette. And if you want to know the secrets of Radio City, you should call me. So I had to, So I've been talking to Rockettes in their 70s and 80s, which is fantastic, and it'll be set there.
We have a daughter-in-law who's a former Rockette, but not of that vintage. She's still quite young and quite glamorous, but if you want to talk to her. But I think we should open it up to your questions. There's such a wealth of material. Yes?
As someone who grew up in Philadelphia, I just have to ask and partially beg, could you do something about Barnes? I just think it's just it's amazing what happened, how he grew his wealth, the collection, the overturn of the will.
Yeah.
I could.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
And
would love to be your assistant on the
there we go.
I just think it would be fabulous.
Yeah, there's so many great places. Philly's a great city, absolutely. And that's what's amazing about America is you can go around and find these houses and these places that are so substantially important within that community and try to bring them. I think you should write it.
No. But I think the Barnes collection, I mean, the Frick is my favorite. Second is the Barnes. And I just think that story could be told in a great way.
Absolutely.
You know, for the Gilded Age, they extensively shot in Troy because, you know, that wonderful expression, which I first learned, I think, visiting Quebec City, preserved by poverty, towns that really have sort of not captured the progress in wealthier towns. They don't ruin anything because they don't have the money to ruin it. So Troy, you could look at Troy, New York. Okay, come on, more questions. Yes?
I wanted to ask her, was the mixed up files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankfeller one of your inspirations?
Yeah, it's funny. My agent, it's one of her favorite books. And she mentioned it a long time ago, and I'd never read it as a kid. So, yeah, no, somehow I was in the Little House on the Prairie books for a long time. And so I definitely think that was part of it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Yeah.
So Ian mentioned the incredibly generous act of our visits when my boys each turned 10. Ian got to know my youngest son, Walker. And one of the treasures for us, admittedly, you're not allowed to do this most of the time, but if you're friends with the director, you get to go to the bowling alley. And I love the way the bowling alley appears in your book, because most people can't even imagine how the engineering of that long ramp that the ball actually just with someone at the end puts the ball at the end and it comes right back to you. I thought it was magical. Did you really only see it one time?
Yeah.
So you're a great observer.
Oh, thank you. And that was helpful because that's also where Helen Frick started the library. You know, was down in the bowling alley. That's where she had all her materials as she started working on it. So it was a wonderful way to kind of bring two things together.
Well, and then it's under the long gallery. When you're in the long gallery and you're looking at all these extraordinary paintings, to think that downstairs is a bowling alley.
Yes, you have no idea what's happening under you.
And it will be preserved, I'm happy to say.
But we won't be going downstairs in the new.
It's hard to get to. There are fire safety reasons why we can't take the public down there. But it's one of the larger spaces in the Frick, so it's used for yoga classes and all kinds of things that you wouldn't expect. My favorite moment there was, I was planning a New York Museum director's bowling party with pizza and the works, and everybody was coming. Thelma Golden of the Studio Museum had bought her special dress, and of course Hurricane Sandy came along, and so I think I'll have that party when we finally reopen in 2024. But I also, New York One, the TV station, filmed something down there. It was like 7 in the morning, and I came and I was asleep. And of course, they got me rolling a gutter ball, which I'll never live down.
All right, I have a question. Frick, haunted? Not haunted? Haunted by whom? Do you ever see anybody roaming around?
I've not seen anybody yet, but walking there at night or early in the morning, I do feel Henry's presence more than anything, because he would indeed kind of stalk down through the rooms and smoke his cigar, and this tough businessman, this was his pleasure. So I feel his presence very much so.
And is it true he would go into the gallery at night, in the middle of the night, and sit there in the dark?
He would, yeah, this is true. I love that. I like the image of the cigar just lit in the darkness.
I too remember as a graduate student in the 70s having to put on the coat. What's going to happen to the Frick Art Reference Library? I've probably been there more often than I've been to the Frick, but it's great.
Well, I invite you to visit the museum side more often, but I'm delighted to have evidence that the Frick Art Reference Library is used. It's, as I mentioned earlier, we had to move entirely off-site. It's at a place upstate New York that specializes in book deposits. And it's an amazing library. It is one of the greatest, it's one of the greatest resources in the world for studying the history of collecting. The range of auction catalogs they have going back to the 17th century is unparalleled. And as was suggested, it's becoming more and more important digitally as well. So it will return. Before the pandemic, before the building project, about 20% of the books were off-site. Helen Clay Frick was amazing to me that she, as was suggested, she started the library in shelves lined up along the bowling alley. Then there was an initial building built in 1924, and it soon wasn't large enough for the expansion of the books. So in 1935, John Russell Pope built what's essentially a 12-story building with library stacks. And the idea that she built this huge building when it was a relatively small library, imagining the growth of the library quite correctly, because from 1935, it wasn't until 1935, until about 1995, so 60 years, that the library was big enough for the expansion of the books, 800,000 volumes now. By 95, we had to start sending things off-site because the building wasn't large enough. So when we return, there will be more books off-site, but what we've learned is we have a very efficient retrieval system. So you can go online, the book will be waiting for you, and what we're doing is increasing the digital services of the library. It's become a leader in many aspects. Its photo archive, for example, we're part of a consortium of photo archives around the world, which has 25 million images and what librarians refer to as metadata, the texts that are associated with it. So they're making all of that online in a way that will extend the reach of the library. But in the end, you'll be able to come back to this beautiful 1935 room, which has portraits of Miss Frick's dogs in fresco on the walls, and it's just such a lovely space, and is a great old-fashioned library at the same time that it's a digitally up-to-date one.
I think we have time for one more question before everybody toodles off to dinner. Yes?
So I've read all your books, Fiona, and I love them all, and I was just wondering if you had a favorite.
Oh. You know, each one is the one I'm working on is the one that I'm kind of consumed with. And what's nice about the books is I find that if I ask, people say to me, oh, this one's my favorite or that one, it all depends on who the person is. Depending on what their interests are, because one might deal with jazz, one deals with art, one will be dealing with dance, and so I kind of like that. I don't think I could pick one. Probably maybe the first one, just because that's how I kind of fell into it, just from an idea of possibly doing an article about the Barbizon Hotel for women, and realizing when it went condo, there were a dozen of these old-time ladies still living there. And they were moved into these rent-controlled apartments on the 4th floor. And I just thought, what a great way to show how the building has changed and what's it like. They were they didn't want to be interviewed at that time. So I couldn't do the article. And I just started thinking, well, if I wrote a book, I could make stuff up, which was really pretty terrifying, to be honest. And that book became The Dollhouse. And when we had the launch party, the head kind of woman from the 4th floor showed up, and she's about this tall with hair this tall, and she walked in and it was like Moses. Everyone just parted, and she was the hit of the place. So that was really kind of wonderful.
Well, thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Elaine and Henry and everyone. Ellen, I think it's dinner time, right?
Thank you.
Thanks.